I will be sharing some fragments from my new book, Humanizing the Corporation. It's the result, the outcome of a life's work. I've been inspired by Stephen Beer, Elliot Jacques' complexity theory, and the fourth one is not visible, but it's developmental theory. And I've written quite a number of books on the bottom here that challenges the assumptions within each of the theories, both including DSM. And the challenge, the ground of the challenge is a deep concern for how we evolve in our society, politically, and also in organizations, because there was about 10 years ago a huge optimism on self-organizing settings. And what we see is that organizations move back into the direction of hierarchy and power. And so I asked myself the question, how does that come? To start with, I have two maps. It's a map, a medieval map, drawn from the Orient, and it shows Europe and how the world was conceived at that time. And the map on the right was a map that was conceived a few years ago, and that pictured the world in terms of how many inhabitants, how many people live per square meter. And the question that I want to leave you with is, what do both maps have in common? And what do they have in common with VSM and collaborative intelligence? So I hope to answer that question by the end of this session. The agenda for today is that I will be speaking in three parts. The first one is, what is VSM teaching us about collaborative intelligence? Yes?
Could I ask whether you're going to be sharing the slides after?
I'm trying to share them, and I hope to be able to put them on the resources today. But I wasn't able to do that yesterday. So you will have the slides. So the first point was, the first question that I will be asking is, what is VSM teaching us about collaborative intelligence? The second one is, what is the heart of regenerative collaboration? And I will point to two core tensions. And the third one is about that doesn't work. No? Right? Yeah. So the third one is about changing the conversation in collaborative settings. The answer to the first question is, well, VSM is teaching us not a lot of things about collaborative intelligence. And that will be the point that I will be trying to make. The real collaborative intelligence is in the conversation that we have with each other. But what does that mean? Again, may I ask to not it's okay. Okay. So, what is VSM teaching us about collaborative intelligence? I assume at this moment that everybody is familiar with the VSM, and that has pointed us to 7 very important conversations. Is the conversation on identity. Let's say how System 5 interacts with System 4 and System 3. It's the identity conversation. The second conversation is about scanning the future. It's about conceiving what we want to prioritize in the future. The third conversation is about adaptation. Once we know how we want the future to be, we can reflect upon what does that mean for the current. The fourth conversation is about resources negotiation. I assume you're all familiar with that. It's how the management is dealing or distributing the resources to the subsidiaries or the teams. The fifth conversation is about coherent action, the sixth about audit, and the seventh is about the stability of the services. What the VSM is this telling us a story about how collaborative intelligence is growing. My point, after having used VSM in quite a lot of situations, is that it doesn't. VSM doesn't tell us something about collaborative intelligence. It tells us something about how you can analyze the system after the facts. It doesn't tell us how a system grows. VSM's strength is about alignment of different systems, but not about the quality of human connection. It's not about how people build trust with each other. VSM is good at explaining coordination, policy making, strategic alignment, but it doesn't inform us about how new value is created. It tells us that there is a structural system that needs to be in place, but it doesn't inform us how those ideas are generated. A third critique on VSM is that it assumes that all voices have an equal voice. VSM doesn't take into consideration the power play. It doesn't take into consideration the asymmetries in agency. It assumes that every participant in the system has an equal voice, which is rarely the case. A fourth critique is that it doesn't explain how collaborative capacity grows over time. And a fifth critique that you can give is that the identity part, system 5, is very instrumental. It's conceived as holding kind of the balance between system 4 and system 3. The key in the identity conception of Stefan Beer is that it doesn't consider ecological issues. It doesn't consider issues of inclusion. It doesn't consider issues of discrimination and so on. So there's a lot of critique you can give on the VSM. But the point is that it doesn't explain how real collaboration evolves. You need a different point of view to do that. And that different point of view, I have found that in developmental theory. I found it in developmental theory, and what do I consider as developmental theory? That is the attention for the knowing from. VSM helps us building insight into the content and the working of a system, the knowing what and the knowing how, but not the knowing from. And let me explain with an example what I mean by knowing from. The real collaboration is achieved through frictions and flows in different ways of knowing, being, and acting together. And to explain that, I would like to do a little example, a little exercise with each of you. Oh, I forgot to blanken the solution, but how would you describe a good leader? Take a moment to think for yourself how you would describe a good leader. And in that description, you probably use concepts. You could say a good leader is someone who can listen. If we answer by using a single concept, we can derive from that, and that's derived from developmental research, that you are in a specific developmental phase. And we know from cognitive research that there are patterns in development. The way we give answers evolve from representations to using abstractions to starting to work with principles. And in each of those broad phases, we can even distinguish three sub-phases, namely answers in single concepts. A good leader is a listener, and in using representations, we come very close to the experience people have. You can also give a single abstract answer. A single abstract answer would be that a good leader is somebody who inspires people. Inspiration is an abstract concept compared with listening. But our development evolves through phases where we go from single concepts to using mappings to using systems. An example of a mapping is an answer such as a good leader has people skills if he reflects confidence and is close to people without being arrogant. So you're building a kind of a flow of thoughts. And that's where language models are very good in. They imitate those flows of thought. What I am not very good at is thinking in terms of principles and in systems thinking. Systems thinking in principles means that you come very close to values statements, such as a good leader is a servant when he looks at what is possible and desirable from new angles and invests in his personal development so that he can better assess expectations of his surroundings and develop new directions together with his team so that he can serve as a servant. So what I want to convey here is that development is a matter of broadening perspective taking. One of the reasons why so many people have difficulties in applying DSM is just because they have not evolved further than using single abstractions. And a second reason is that from each conception of reality, from each perspective taking, the concepts that we use, also those in DSM like coordination, like operations, like management, are defined differently. So the perspective taking evolves, and that's only one line of development. There are other lines of development, and one of the most important ones that is now researched is the cognitive development, where people evolve from a kind of an expert thinking towards considering part whole thinking. That means that what we conceive, we always put that in a bigger picture. When we say a good leader is a listener, well, we imagine a context where that listening is shaped. The development cognitively goes from single expert thinking to part whole to dynamic, coherent, or metamorphosis thinking. And that equals questions such as how is something part of a broader context? How does something change and emerge? If you haven't got a conception of how things change, if people are unable to put their conception of coordination in an evolving context of coordination, you will have a much more difficult dialogue with them. If they cannot derive which are the critical relationships and our coherent thinking, it can be quite difficult to find common ground. And so collaborative intelligence will not be developed. And the metamorphosis thinking is about how you connect the four other sets of thinking: the expert, the part whole, the dynamic, and the coherence thinking. Cognitive development informs us what kind of cohesion will be developed, what kind of common ground will be developed in a group. And depending on where you are, where individuals in a team are, you will have quite different conversations. And those who work with VSM have already experienced that even the same concepts can mean a lot of different things for all the participants in the room. But there is a second line of development, which is very important, and that's the identity development that flows over an attention for the me, the I, versus the we. And development goes from a very instrumental point of view, considering the other as transactional. Identity development basically is about how is one's capability for a meta perspective on his or her own ego. Yeah? And that develops from instrumental, meaning putting yourself in the middle and considering others as transactional instrumental objects. We have even world leaders who do that. To dependent, that means that I'm unable to reflect upon what I have internalized from others. To self-authoring, which means that I'm able to transcend my own perspective and integrate perspectives of others to self-aware. That's basically the line of development. VSM assumes that people are able to reflect in a self-authoring way. Research tells us that about 70% of the people in groups do not transcend the first two phases in identity development. But what does that mean for collaborative intelligence? In each group, you have a spread of individuals. And if you can define a role, a task, an accountability, for example, this accountability, the green line, equals continuous improvement, the kind of challenge that you find in agile or lean contexts. So if that's the developmental spread of people, that says that 4 people are more capable than 3 others, you will have in that team a kind of reflection that is different from the blue line, where one is tasked to reorganize, let's say, an organization, a system as a whole, and that you need to look at the coherence of things. If that this team is confronted with the first task, we say that that team is upwardly divided. That means that most members have the cognitive depth and breadth to transcend the challenge at hand. If that team would tackle the blue assignments, and often when you look at systems, the interrelationships, the messiness, the complexity is very, very hard. And you have teams that are unable to cope with that complexity. What are they doing? They are simplifying it. They are redefining the tasks. They are fragmenting it. And so you have a very hard time to really establish collaborative intelligence. That's what developmental theory is telling us, and that also corresponds with the huge number of experiences that I have in teams which are even very enthusiastic to find solutions for the issues, but they still are not able to do that. Or if they have found solutions, they do not get implemented and no change happens. The identity development issue defines what type of autonomy one will take. The further to the left, the more autonomy you will take from your own ego and even not understand what needs and expectations and viewpoints of others are. The more on the right, the more you can transcend others' perspectives. Now, what does that mean for collaborative intelligence? What does that mean for regenerative collaboration? I've become interested in the theme of regeneration some 8 years ago through companies. Some of them I had as clients, and some were pointed to me by clients. They said, yeah, you need to look at those organizations too. And you see those organizations in all kinds of industries, with all kinds of sizes. The companies, what they have in common is that they transcend the logic of the industrial organizations and the sustainable oriented organizations. Industrial companies, for me, are companies who extract resources and follow kind of a linear production, selling, and at the end, leaving the goods produced on a waste belt. Sustainable companies are highly involved in circularity. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been an organization that came to the foreground. But essentially, at the end, things are left on the waste belt. Circularity is meant to do less harm, but it's still extractive. And I became interested in regenerative companies. Regenerative companies investing in well-being. And what you see in those companies is that they act in a very ecosystemic way. They do not feel the urge to have vertical integration or horizontal integration. They have a kind of a natural collaborative intelligence that they are developing. And the question that I asked was, well, what is key, what is happening in those organizations that is differently? And can we accelerate the transition from sustainable to regenerative companies? And what I found is that those companies hold two core tensions, a systemic one, and the systemic one is derived from Ivo Velichow's essential balance. It's the balance between diversity and stability. It's a systemic balance, and it's a balance that is included in the viable systems model, but not often made explicit in the viable systems model. And the second tension is the one on sense making. Sense making, by which I mean perspective taking. And it's the interrelationship between the two that will determine the type of co-creation, the type of collaboration, and the quality of decision making that happens in collaborative systems. I will explain it with an example in just a moment, but I wanted to point out that diversity stability tension is a tension that happens in space and in time. Diversity is basically something that is present in the space. At this moment, we are in a context where we are all unique people, we are diverse. That's something in this space. Stability is something that happens over time, that gets repeated or not repeated, and is in tension with instability, while diversity is in tension with homogeneity. You can ask, we are different people, but we are all interested in systems and cybernetics, and potentially we are perhaps not so diverse in this room. And if you are not so diverse, developmental differences will surface. We have seen that in the small discussions just before the break.
Jen?
Yes? Yes?
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yes, you may ask.
When you say, how committed are you to the word attention? Because as you're presenting, and I really like what you're saying, you're making me think rather than tension, you're thinking people like yin and yang.
Yes.
Where they are heard and only hold through.
That's correct.
Is that an acceptable substitute?
That's an acceptable point of view. Tensions are not there to be resolved, but are there to be taken into consideration and included in the decision making. So it's not an either or, it's an and. And it's in considering the tensions that you will be able to start understanding how differentiation and integration happens. Because in collaborative intelligence, that's the key that happens. But let me first go to the sense making, which is developmentally defined here. And that's the autonomic cohesion balance with maturity as the maturity is the tension with dependence. For example, in the autonomy that one takes is often defined by the group one wants to belong to, and is thus not a pure autonomy, but is always independence with what you identify with in the group, and thus there is an aspect of conformity in the autonomy. While dependence is also not pure. Dependence, depending on the developmental phase you're in, you will always experience tensions, moments where you cannot follow the group. And that will define whether you take autonomy or not. And in collaborative intelligence, you need to build upon the diversity, but the diversity that will be put into practice is limited by how the group solves that tension. And you have the breadth and the depth of thinking, which is about what do we see that brings connection, that brings coherence, versus what remains disconnected in systems. I once had a trajectory of 9 months with a company reorganization where I used viable systems model. And after 9 months, I found out that there still was a huge disconnection between the system 1s, 2s, and 3s in that collaborative context. And that had to do with how deep and how broad people were thinking at that moment. So I excluded kind of the sense making and assumed that if we would discuss all the systems in a transparent way, starting from what they did, and thinking through what they did and building a model around it, inspired by VSM, that I would get a solution. and that was not the case. The tensions, systems, and structure, you see that in 5 principles in regenerative settings. I don't have the time to explain every principle, but I will go into one example in just a moment. What I want to say is that if you look at regenerative organizations, what I see is that this equilibrium, the disequilibrium that is that you can consider as a motor, as a driver for development, comes from a friction within each of those principles. For example, in critical reflexivity, you have the as a systemic choice there, working within a person's as a systemic choice, you have in companies the design of performance and development systems, and at the sense-making part, you have the design of challenges within one's zone of proximal development. That means that if you are somewhere on the developmental curve, not everybody is ready for a systemic task. You need to take into consideration where one is in his or her development. But that critical reflexivity is in tension with other parts of the regenerative flower. For example, reciprocal empathy is about how do I define the boundaries in the system. The regenerative flower, from a helicopter point of view, informs you what is the quality of the information and the variety that you take into account to build systems. While in viable systems model, the question on the quality of the variety increasing and the variety reducing information is not made very explicit. It's in the viable system model, but it's not made explicit. The differentiation, the expansion of perspectives in VSM is looked for in the variety increasing channels, while in regenerative organizations it can emerge from external and internal sources, by which I mean much more sources than the variety increasing channels. It also happens within the consciousness of the participants involved, how they deal with the information. Information is not something that is objectively, that can be objectively grasped. And the integration happens in VSM through the variety decreasing channels, while in regenerative organizations, you see that it has to do with the capacity to synthesize complexity, and thus the cognitive development of people comes to the foreground. Let me illustrate it with the House of Hackney. House of Hackney is an interior decoration house. It's based in London. I deliberately chose an example not so far from here. And one of the principles that we have is dealing with ambiguity and dealing with tough issues. In the vital systems model, that's kind of in the background, that question. And what you see in the House of Hackney is that systemic-wise, they have designed holistic conversation. They use a lot of holistic conversation design to work together. For example, a holistic conversation design for this group would mean that we would start discussing an issue in groups of 2, then after 10 minutes merge in groups of 4, after 15 minutes in groups of 8, and after half an hour we would be in groups of 16, and in 3/4 of an hour we would have a joint discussion. That's an example of holistic conversation design. So in dealing with ambiguity and multiple interpretations, you see a huge variety of holistic conversation designs appearing. But that holistic conversation design is always backed by sense-making mechanisms. And sense-making mechanisms in the House of Hackney, what I observed is a dialogical use of indicators. We all know KPIs, key performance indicators. Well, in regenerative companies, KPIs stand for key perspective indicators. And that's quite a difference. The indicators serve as a step up to scope tasks, to scope projects. For example, one of the objectives that the House of Hackney has is removing all wood from making wallpaper, removing all chemical substances from wallpaper. They have specific indicators, but those indicators are not used to evaluate people. Let's say at the end of the year, how much tons chemical products do we have removed from our products? That's not the case, but it's used to build collaborative collaborations with chemical companies, for example, and the indicators steer whom should be present in the dialogue. They steer the scoping of the projects and the dialogue. And in that sense, the House of Hackney, which has now about 52 collaborators, employees, they succeed in transforming in the UK at this moment the chemical industry, because they move the chemical industry into a direction of looking at other possibilities to manufacture wallpaper. In doing that, they also have quite a number of alliances with wood mills, because those, when you remove the wood from the wallpaper, you should close down those small mills. And in many small towns, that's the only source of income that people have. Well, what they do with those mills is that they bring them into contact with those chemical companies to ensure that they adapt their mills in a way that they can produce wallpaper without pulp of wood. That's what I call collaborative intelligence. That's where co-creation happens. Co-creation happens where the systemic interventions and the systemic tensions between stability and diversity are carefully managed. And the House of Hackney does that in a sense that each year they, for example, have supplier meetings. And in the first year, they did it with their immediate suppliers. In the second year, they invited their suppliers to bring with them their suppliers, their second line suppliers. The third year, their third line suppliers. Through holistic conversations, they look very quickly, because most of those suppliers, they do not have the time, and they find such settings rather odd. So they need conversation design to come to collaborative intelligence solutions very quickly, but they can only do that because upfront they have sensed what kind of key perspective indicators, what kind of sense making they would motivate the different parties in the system. And they do not only do such meetings with suppliers, they also do that with clients, they do that with their own collaborators. In doing that with their own employees, they kind of reconceived the labor contracts they have with their people. They follow the seasons, for example. They have a 4-day work week, but in the winter, a 4-day work week might be 21 hours, while in the summer, it may be 40 hours, because in the winter, it's earlier dark, and in the summer, the sun shines later. So we follow the seasons, and they kind of include nature in their decision making. So the key in what is happening and where real collaborative intelligence appears is in the conversation in collaborative settings. And here you have a quite extensive table. It's derived from Otto Scharmer. But it basically informs us that there are several conversational fields, from downloading, debating, reflective dialogue, and generative dialogue. A lot of dialogues that we do using all kinds of frameworks and models are in the field of debating and reflective dialogue. But what you see in regenerative companies is that there is a more fundamental level of dialogue, namely generative dialogue. It's in VSN focus, the dialogue that leads to very conscious decision making, where identity is concerned as something very serious, and where new recursion patterns emerge. And you can ask yourself the question, if you look at the themes or the context that you are in yourself, what is the typical depth of the conversation? And is the conversation going so deep that you're able to handle the tensions between the systems part and the sense-making part? Because it's only when you're able to do that, that you will make real progress and get new ideas on structures, accountabilities, processes really anchored in a system. So the point that I want to make is that we humanize the corporation not by rewriting structures alone, but by regenerating the conversations that hold the structures in place. And I get a signal to wrap up, which brings me to my first slide. What is basically the relationship between all the maps we use?
Perspective?
It's the perspective taking. Each map informs us about a certain perspective, but what it excludes are the tensions that you need to navigate those maps, nor the contemporary charts of the population, nor the medieval chart informs us about the use and the tensions that appear with using those maps. And so it doesn't inform us about the quality of the conversation we have. And in order to understand the quality of the conversation, we need the insights into the sense making and the systems and the interrelationships of the two. That's basically what I wanted to convey. Any questions left? Or I don't know if we have still time for 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
Yeah. I think we should move it.
Second line.
We don't have a.
There's a fixed. Yeah, I have a question. You got it?
No, I just wanted to, I was curious because I really like the whole thing and the way that you are considering regenerative organizations and the whole thing that I find it fascinating, but the way that, I mean, John and me have been writing a lot about viability and sustainability with the same idea of regenerative organizations without naming them as regenerative organizations. It's only recently that we are beginning to realize that that's what we were going. But the way that we understand the ESM is the way that you understand regenerative organizations. So, I mean, in that respect, perhaps it would be good to clarify that your interpretation of the DSM, the way that you describe it, is not necessarily the original way it was, or not necessarily the only way we can see it. I think that the way that you describe regenerative organizations could be an evolution of the regenerative. Yeah, would you agree?
I agree. What's important is the consciousness of the user of VSM. And either through that consciousness, one will be able to elevate the use of VSM and bring it to the level of regeneration or not. But in order to bring it to the level of regeneration, you need to expand the view and be believe of that.
No, it's brilliant. I mean, the question of the young, the part, the conversation, the tensions. I mean, absolutely brilliant. So I stop. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, as Andrew said, we're looking at similar things and really like what you're doing. There are a number of things that I would take issue with. And this is a conversation I had with Ivo when he was writing his book, and we were discussing it. In ecological systems, the more diversities, the more stabilities. This whole thing that Ivo thinks is a tension between stability and diversity. I think is not correct. But that's just that's probably a side issue. The other thing is going back to Stafford's original VSM. When people started using control for System 3, Stafford hated it. Yeah. It really doesn't fit in with his understanding of the model. And as Andrew says, the model has evolved and changed. And I think one of the jobs we have to do at Metaforum is to be very clear about Stafford's vision of VSM and how people diverge to that, because there's a lot of stuff going on, despite large divergences from the original understanding of it. But by and large, I think what you're doing is very important, because the VSM has this extraordinarily strong framework. Everything you're doing, you get the framework, you get the essence, all the interactions, patterns of relationships. But very often you get to this point where you're applying it to a particular context, and you think, okay, I'm supposed to do this, this, and this, but how on earth do I do that? And I think what you're doing is giving us a lot of really important information about how we do that and the consequences of consciousness and the people we're talking with and their personal developments, and a whole range of things which I think are very important.
You can look at Stafford's work from the developmental point of view, and you could say that he was a bright metamorphosis thinker, and he was quite operating from a self-aware point of view. And logically, he was a principal systems thinker. What I observe amongst, for example, my students, is that when they start to apply VSM, they apply it from their developmental level, which often does not correspond with Stafford's intentions. And that creates a whole set of tensions that has to do with the two core tensions that I'm sharing today. And so you need to be able to take a meta perspective on that to be able to understand what is happening and to understand what people are struggling with.
So we have a question, and then I'll come back to you. It's a lovely presentation. I really like your thinking. However, I'm very new to VSM, so despite my grey hair, like 6 weeks ago, I disagree. So I think that from what I've understood of VSM as I've dived into it, a fundamental part of it is that it is by definition regenerative. That in order to maintain the homeostasis, whatever the homeostasis you choose, the whole point is that the system is regenerative. That's how it maintains the homeostasis. So I disagree definitionally with the way I heard you say it. Perhaps that's not what you meant. Where I agree with you definitionally is in what you said where if you've got students to work that. So VSM is an ontological thing, right? It's a model that exists in the world. I think from my very new and probably very weak in this audience understanding of what Dr. Bahir was saying, I don't think he was so much putting it forward as a methodology as observing the truth that all homeostatic systems, right, will exhibit these canonical structures. If you're thinking of it as a methodology, so how do VSM practitioners, so now these are people who are looking at some methodology, then I completely agree that in order to get to start for them to think regeneratively and understand the regenerative metaphor of praxis, for the thing, then I think what you made makes sense. So very respectfully, and I say it more in the hope of being educated by the civil streets audience than anything else.
Well, I can agree, but still ask yourself the question, what does VSM tell you about how connection is built, how about empathy, how relationships are built?
Thank you very much. I like very much your presentation and the emphasis that you place on the conversations. The one observation or critic, we may say, that normally they do to the VSM is what are the human beings and how do they communicate about whatever aspect of the VSM is related. My question is very concrete. You mentioned 7 kinds of conversations. How is the design of the decision environment? This is a curiosity. You do it in a small space with a certain number of people, 1, 2, 3, 6, or you use a different kind of environment with more wider groups. And what kind of help elements do you use? You use some screens or just conversations, or you use a variety of things, integrity. What kind of help do you use to facilitate the conversation?
It's a very good question, and we can talk for hours on that, but a very short answer. The first question that I always consider is, at what level of recursion are we talking about? What is the level of work we are talking about? Because the conversation on a strategic level is quite different than conversations on an operational level. And you design those conversations differently. So at an operational level, often people are less developed, so more on the left side of the curve, and that means that you need to design the conversations very hands-on, very practical, very short-termist. While the more you move into, for example, the operational process design, end-to-end design in companies, you need usually far more holistic design tools than on the operational level. But if you still go higher, you will have scenario thinking and other kinds of future forward thinking tools. So every recursive level, in my opinion, has its own sets of conversational tools. And some of them are discussed in my work in practices of dynamic collaboration. You have there an analysis of the type of conversations that you have at different levels and what helps you to avoid the narrowing of the conversation or the broadening of the conversation. Because there is an optimal conversation design at each level of the curve.
Thank you very much.
We still have one question.
Okay,
Yes, promised.
He was the very first.
Yeah.
okay, please make it quick. Lunch is ready. The other group's going downstairs. We need to be back at 1:45, so if you can make it as quick as you can.
It's a very simple question. Can you just tell us or tell me in one sentence what is collaborative intelligence?
What is collaborative intelligence for me is the quality of co-creation, sensing, and decision making.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne. It was really excellent.